Scarring and piercing. What I'm going to talk about today is how getting pierced will cause scarring and kind of give you a basic overview of it. Coming up next on New to Piercing, episode number 27. For those who are new to the channel, welcome to the Body Piercing and Tattooing channel. Hope you're enjoying the videos. Hope you're finding it helpful and useful, but you may not know who I am. My name is DaVo. I'm a professional body piercer and have been since 1994. I own and operate the Axiom Body Piercing studio located right here in Des Moines, Iowa, inside Skin Kitchen Tattoo. So what I'm going to talk about today, like I said, is about scarring. I think it's kind of a misconception and something I commonly hear, especially from parents bringing their children in to get a piercing. Oh, if things don't work out, they can just take it out and then they won't have a piercing and everything will go fine. We don't really talk about scarring a lot, especially during the consultation and introduction to somebody new to piercing, mainly because I think we worry that it may affect whether or not they get that piercing or not. So I'm going to cover some things today, like what scarring is normal, what's abnormal scarring. Also, I'm going to cover piercings that are more likely to cause scarring and more noticeable scarring than other piercings. So let's start off with what's normal. Normal scarring is going to be a circular incision or hole. It's going to look just about like a piercing opening. Usually, how big it is really depends on how thick the jewelry was that was initially pierced with. And that varies from piercing to piercing. Of course, piercings that are below the neck are going to be thicker jewelry, so larger gauge or thicker gauges. Lip piercing will be slightly thicker than what maybe you're going to do on an earlobe or an eyebrow, kind of the same thing. So how big that scar is and how noticeable it is really depends on what piercing it is and what the thickness of it is. But normal scarring is going to kind of just have a circle, kind of looks like a piercing without the jewelry in. Usually, the tissue around the piercing is going to be about normal. You normally don't see a lot of discolorization or anything else. The hole itself oftentimes won't match the same tissue color, maybe a slightly different, maybe lighter or darker color to it, but pretty much looks like an empty piercing. Now, over time, these piercing hole or the scarring will fade. It may take a couple months to a year, or it may take a decade. It varies greatly from piercing to piercing, and it really depends on how thick that jewelry is and where the location is and where people are more prone to have lasting visible scars. Other thing that could be a contributing factor to how much scarring you're going to see is how long the piercing's been in. The more seasoned the piercing is, the longer it's been a part of you, the more scarring you're going to see, or at least the longer that scarring's going to last. For example, if you got a piercing done and you take it out after a week, you're going to see a lot less scarring than you're going to see if you've had that piercing in, let that piercing grow and develop over a long period of time, and you've had it in for a couple decades, and then you take it out. That hole is going to be there for and noticeable, that scarring, much, much longer. And it's important to understand that when you pierce your body and then put a piece of jewelry in there which causes your body to grow scar tissue around that piercing, you are permanently changing your body. It will never go back completely to the way it was beforehand. So that scarring is a normal part of getting a piercing. Now let's talk about abnormal scarring. Probably the most common or problem that we see with them is bumps. Bumps are caused by usually agitation, piercings done incorrectly, incorrect jewelry. There's always a possibility of some form of infection that's happened or allergic reaction. Bumps, in most cases, will go away over a period of time. It's common for people to call these keloids. They usually aren't unless you're someone who is genetically prone to keloiding. It's a situation where your body produces too much scar tissue. For example, if you get a cut on your finger or on your arm, the scarring will be normally 2 to 3 times larger than the amount of, or the size of the wound. And in some cases will continue to get larger and larger over time and require medical treatment. Normal scarring or bumps, that usually, if we can figure out what's going on, they usually go away. Redness around the piercing. This is usually a sign of something that's not going right, but in some cases, the scarring can be very red. That can fade over time, but it's definitely something you want to address with your piercer because something is not right in most cases. Line scarring caused by rejection. Now, when a piercing begins to reject, it will usually give off signs that it is rejecting. And most common ones are as the area around the piercing will get very scabby and dry, and your body will slowly push it out. The longer you leave in a piercing that's rejecting, the more scarring you're going to see. It's going to increase around that. This is common with navel piercings that are done incorrectly. That's why if you ever see somebody that has that bright purple scarring going on, it's because that piercing rejected. Sometimes this will happen with migration, but not nearly as much. But the situation comes down to this. If a piercing starts to reject, the best option is to remove the jewelry as soon as possible to reduce the amount of scarring that you do see. Hypertrophic scarring. This is a raised or a bump around the piercing or a tube-like scarring. It's where your body produces too much collagen and it kind of overgrows or overheals the piercing. These can be a bit of a problem, and they're usually a sign of agitation or abuse to the piercing or some form of trauma. And oftentimes, there's nothing you can do but remove the jewelry to make it go away, to make it stop. Sometimes if you isolate the piercing and give it time, it will fade over time, but not always. These are really common with piercings that are through cartilage, like helixes, ear piercings in general, nostril piercings. Really is one of the reasons why it's so important to isolate that piercing during the healing process. Keep everything away from it. Don't sleep on it. Be careful of hair, clothing, helmets, hats, headwear, anything that may come in contact with it. You do want to avoid that contact. The next one is common with navel piercings. It's a situation where if you tan during the healing process, the scarring around the piercing holes can be a different pigment color, and it can become permanent. It's why I don't suggest tanning with a fresh piercing, especially navels. Nipples can do this sometimes, but it's pretty uncommon. But it's mainly, I've seen this mostly in navels. Either that or cover up the area with like a cloth or a towel or something while you're tanning. Last one is hammerhead scarring, which is it's kind of scarring, it kind of isn't scarring. These are common on mainly male nipple piercings. It's where the body, because of where the piercing is placed, instead of it just the nipple kind of developing around it and it looking like the nipple is pierced on both sides, it'll have this additional tunnel of tissue that kind of comes out from it, kind of like a hammerhead shark. There's not really much you can do about this when this happens other than, I guess not let it happen by not piercing that deep on a male nipple. It's always a risk with certain people if they have very underdeveloped nipples, and your piercer should talk to you about this before they do the piercing to let you know that this is a possibility and make sure that you're okay with it. Lastly, I'm going to talk about what piercings are more common to produce scar tissue that's extremely noticeable. The first one is oral piercings, especially cheek piercings. They will create an indentation scar that will never probably go away. It may fade over time, but the reality is you're going to have that scar for a very long time. The same thing with lip piercings, anything that's on the lower lip or upper lip, from medusas and beauty marks to any type of labret or lip piercing. These can appear open for decades and decades after the piercing has been abandoned. Depending on the thickness of the jewelry that you initially pierced with and what it was healed with, these can be very, very large and hard to hide, or they can be very small. With cheek piercings, it doesn't really matter. They're always going to leave that indentation. I know people want the dimples. They want that dimple look. I don't think it looks the same because it's usually bright red or a different pigment than the actual piercing. If you're considering getting cheek piercings done for that reason, I would advise against it because that's not what your end result's going to be. Bridge piercings. Bridge piercings are in the center of your nose at the top. They can create line scarring. That's like the worst case scenario. Also, if they get any trauma during the healing piercing or during the healing period, They can create bumps and other things that are difficult to get rid of. If they're done correctly, minimal scarring, you're always going to have those 2 dots on both ends, and they're going to be noticeable for years after the piercing has been abandoned. Eyebrow piercings. If the piercing heals correctly without any issues and doesn't reject or tear, you're probably not going to notice it that much. There's going to be 2 indentation scars, and there's also going to be kind of a raised area where that piercing once was. Now, if it rejects, it can get to the point where you have a line right there that hair won't grow through or what have you. It's one of the reasons why it's very important that if a piercing starts rejecting, to remove the jewelry. Dermals and surface-to-surface piercings. Both of these will leave pretty predominant scars once they're removed, partly because it's in the face. They're very noticeable with surface-to-surface piercings. If they reject, you can get that line scar where the scarring is a lot larger than it was possibly going to be if you would have just simply removed the jewelry at the first sign of rejection. Industrial piercings. Now, industrial piercings will leave a lot of scarring, and they also kind of change the shape or how those, in some cases, how the helix actually looks, because it kind of changes how it sits. They can be noticeable years after the jewelry is removed. Most of the scarring you're going to see with these is piercings that were done on anatomies that weren't meant to be industrial piercings, or it's a situation where the body just kind of adapted to that jewelry being in place as it is. This is not really a huge thing, but really with industrials, usually the best option is if you start seeing major problems with it, just to remove the jewelry, especially with rejection, because it's not going to get any better. Stretched earlobes. Stretched earlobes at some point, usually about 2 gauge or so. It gets to a point where the hole is big enough that your body can no longer contract that tissue and close it. They will be very noticeable, especially large ones where you have the loop, and there's not really much you can do about it other than having plastic surgery. Male nipples, already talked about the hammerhead situation, but usually the nipple will increase in size, and that is something that's never going to change. There will always be those 2 indentation scars that maybe is not so noticeable. The same thing with female nipples, or usually isn't that overly noticeable unless you look really close. But the hammerhead thing, that won't go away once you remove the jewelry. It's going to stay the same. Navel piercings. With navel piercings, especially if it's a situation where you become pregnant, you leave the jewelry in, it kind of stretches out the hole, or if it's a piercing that's rejecting, it's going to leave scarring. And usually the scarring on your stomach is very purple oriented, bright red. It's very noticeable, and it's not something that easily goes away. If the piercing heals easily, goes through the whole process, and hasn't been stretched by pressure being put on the piercing like you would have during a pregnancy, usually you'll just end up with an indentation scar, just like any other piercing. But if you leave it in, you have these problems, you're going to see a lot of scarring. A lot of times when we redo them, if we're doing like a floating navel on something that somebody tried to do a navel piercing on and just did a weird surface-to-surface piercing, usually when we do those, we try to do it in a way that if you put a large enough end on it, that it can kind of hide some of that scarring. And the last one is any piercing that rejects or migrates. You're going to always see more scarring on those. Usually, like I said, your best option is remove it at the first sign of issues. Well, that's it. What is your experience with scarring? Have you had some piercings that you retired or abandoned? What was the scarring like on it? Please leave a comment. Another thing I was going to go into is how to reduce scarring, but to be honest with you, I don't have enough experience with that, or I didn't have the time to do enough research. Maybe I'll dig into that at some point. But if you guys have some remedies that worked for you, what were your results like, and etc., feel free to leave a comment for others. Till next time, here's hoping all your piercings heal with ease and without a single issue. And if you're in the Des Moines, Iowa area, I would love to see you for your piercing needs in the future. Have a good day, everybody. Take care, and we'll see you in that next video.